There is something really cathartic about completely defying people's expectations. I remember when I was in high school, I went to a weekend church camp with some guys from all over Southwest Virginia, and 2 or 3 were from my home church. And one afternoon while we were there, a group of us organized a game of ultimate frisbee. We picked our captains, and they started to pick teams. And I assume it's because I was and always have been such a striking figure of raw human athleticism. It wasn't that funny. But as the players were selected out to their sides, I was picked dead last. My good buddy Elliot was also picked for my team, and I noticed as pick after pick went by and I remained standing in line, he had this little growing smirk on his face, and he just stared into the ground, trying not to make eye contact with me. So the game was set to begin, and like a kickoff in football, ultimate frisbee begins with one team throwing off, sending the frisbee from one end of the field to the team on the other. And as our opponents prepared to throw, my buddy looked at me with raised eyebrows and his trademark little smirk, and I gave him a nod. And our opponent rears back with all of his strength, and he fires the frisbee across the pitch, while his team charged our way, and my team fanned out to set up for our first series. And as the frisbee arced towards our end of the field, out of the corner of my eye, I see this streak as Elliot takes off at a sprint. But before our illustrious team captain had the chance, I stepped out from the end zone, eye on the frisbee, and confidently raised my hand and said, "I got it." In my periphery, I literally heard one of the guys on my team roll his eyes and groan. The frisbee was not even in my hands for a second before I whipped the disc away with a pretty effortless flick, and it zipped the entire length of the field over all of the confused heads of everyone and landed perfectly in the back corner of the end zone, right in the waiting hands of my buddy Elliot. Everyone on the field stopped and turned and looked at me with the most incredulous faces, and I just kind of shrugged and said, "I'm pretty good at frisbee." Now, I'm self-aware enough to understand why I was picked last by total strangers. I have very few stories of sports triumph, and you've now heard the majority of them. I was not someone that they expected to be terribly athletic or very fast or have any skills that were needed for that game. And for the most part, they were right. And they had no way of knowing that ultimate frisbee, of all things, was the one sport that I was really good at. I was, in my day, a wizard with the disc, and I could put a pass wherever I wanted, and when I was playing at home with friends, I never got picked last. But they judged me by what they could see, and they discovered that they had judged poorly. This kind of judgment is super easy to make. We make snap decisions all the time, judging things by outward appearances and preconceived notions, and often we can find that those were very wrong. I think the process of admitting our own failure to judge a situation well, and then moving forward well with the new information and understanding that we've received, is an important skill to practice and hone in our daily life. And as children of God, I believe that we are called to see one another in the ways that God sees us. God sees and knows our hearts, our whole hearts. And so we are called to know one another in community so that we might not simply rely on snap judgments, preconceived notions, biases, or at worst, prejudice. There is such strength in knowing our neighbor and in being known by others. Like a friend who will take off running with a smirk on their face because they know you're going to find them in the back of the end zone. When our true gifts, callings, and whole hearts are known to one another, I believe that we begin to see each other as God sees. On one level, a good heart, an understanding of our heart, is at the heart of this story of David's calling. Samuel, in his call to anoint the next king of God's people, is told to look beyond the outward appearance of the sons of Jesse to their heart. Therefore, the next king is not one of the 7 strong, handsome sons of Jesse, but the 8th, the shepherd David, who is tending his flock. God judges the sons and sees to the heart of David and says, "This will be my king." Yet still, the human eyes of Samuel, who cannot see to the heart, notes only his ruddy appearance and beautiful eyes. It's so human of him, while God sees to the heart of this gentle shepherd, gifted musician and psalmist, and cunning king that is not yet apparent to Samuel's eyes. But this isn't the only time that the gifts of David are overlooked in his story. I once heard a nerdy theologian like me offer some commentary on the well-known and beloved story of David and Goliath. He said, "We always imagine that scene where the young boy David slays the great Philistine warrior Goliath as a battle where David has no chance. It's often like imagining a fight between the Incredible Hulk and Kermit the Frog. And somehow Kermit wins." But this theologian says that's not really the story of David at all. He said, "I imagine this battle as being one between the Incredible Hulk and Jedi Master Yoda. You could easily write Yoda off as having no chance because he's 3 feet tall and 900 years old. But his Jedi skill and mastery of the Force would make him a formidable fighter, and Yoda would likely win that fight." Y'all didn't think my sermons were going to get less nerdy when Pastor Lauren got back. There's no chance. But the nerdy point that my colleague was trying to make here was that David was no Kermit. He had gifts and skills, talents that would allow him to excel in this moment when he battled Goliath. The sling he used was one that shepherds used to defend their fields and that warriors used in battle, and David was very adept and deadly with it. He trusted in his gifts that God had given him more than he feared the foe that was before him. This was an important part of David's story. All of these stories of David, from his call story to his great triumph over Goliath, they're all stories that cause me to question who in my life I may be overlooking. What gifts and skills am I not noticing in my neighbor? Who has a Yoda within them, or can sling a frisbee a country mile, or can share Christ's love in ways we never expected? God has blessed each of us with gifts and hearts that can help make God's love and way of justice and hope known here on earth. How are we using those gifts? How are we embracing those gifts in one another? How are we growing in our gifts and growing in faith that we might merge our gifts into faithful service that transforms the world in God's name and shares God's goodness with all we meet? God knows our whole hearts and calls us to know the heart of our neighbor before we are drawn to judgment. God challenges us through David to not write anyone off, but to grow deeper in community and curiosity as we learn more about the ways that God has gifted us. But when I say that God knows our whole heart, I do mean our whole heart. And to preach a sermon about the good heart of David and his giftedness would be a disservice that misses the fullness of his picture and the fullness of God's grace. Because ultimately, I would say that David is not a particularly good man. He's a deeply flawed hero in his own story, and it's important that we remember his whole heart. David does some truly horrible things. Ultimately, and perhaps most severely, he lusts after Bathsheba, assaults her, and sends her husband out into the vanguard into battle so that he dies in order to cover his sin. While he is still an important and influential king, I look at these stories and say David was not wholly a good person, so I struggle with a simple, just be good like David and God will see your heart kind of sermon. It's inauthentic and it misses the point of remembering David's life, because people are messier than that. In the midst of David's brokenness, after the assault of Bathsheba, David offers the words that we hear today in Psalm 51, which seek forgiveness. This pursuit of turning our brokenness over to God that we might repent, be reconciled, and find our way in God's way again, is how the relationship is restored and able to continue. It's how hearts are made whole again. We are called to forgive as we have been forgiven, and God knows this is no easy task. It is complex. Being a community of forgiveness and reconciliation does not mean that we are to let sin like David's, like Saul's, or like ours go by unchallenged. When we confront sexual violence and selfishness, hatred, white supremacy, bigotry, Christian nationalism, and any other divisions within our world today, we are doing the work of justice to which we are called. And we are always to remember that the individuals who have been warped by sin are in fact beloved children of God. We are called to work towards reconciliation and leave judgment to the Lord. David belongs to God, whether I think he's a good guy or not. Because in the end, it matters what's in our heart. God has a heart for mercy and forgiveness. We know this through the freedom we each have, that we've each received through Jesus Christ. This same Jesus who we hear today continues God's work of calling and equipping the people to serve. As Jesus reminds us, do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. God has a heart for mercy and forgiveness that sees the whole heart of God's beloved creation. And so we are called to have hearts for mercy and forgiveness as well, because anger and division dominate the heart so easily. Forgiveness is far more about releasing our hearts from bondage than it is about releasing others from sin. That is God's work, not ours. But forgiveness does not mean forgetting. Particularly for those who have been abused or who are trapped in abusive relationships, forgiveness is not a means by which people are called to stay in abusive settings. We are called to free our hearts through forgiveness of the ways that others would seek to take hold of us through the pain. But we are also called to remember who has wronged us, to remove ourselves from pain. This is an important distinction to hold when hearing David's story, as so many of us know those who feel they cannot escape cycles of violence, and so often forgiveness is used to hold them in their place of suffering. This is not the point. Forgiveness is about freedom, a wholehearted freedom, a freedom to live as God's people, a people who entrust justice to their God and do not presume to be God ourselves. Forgiveness is about a freedom for our hearts, a freedom from pain and anger and hatred and jealousy and division, a freedom to be seen and known and called and respond to God's grace that we might walk in new life with Christ. This story is complicated. David's story, the Bible's story, is not chicken soup for the soul. It's not feel-good stories for people who feel good. These are broken stories of broken people for broken people. And they are the stories of a God who is making all things new and all hearts whole again. So let us hear stories like that of David and return judgment to the Lord, that we might seek the way of forgiveness and humility that leads to God's way of love being made known here and now. Christ is with us now with this word of redemption, that we might have hearts open to being known, and that we might see the open hearts, the whole hearts of those we'd otherwise overlook. May God give us the hearts and eyes to see creation as God does. Amen.